What is up, my beautiful gemstones? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be discussing so-called impossible murders. Now, it is a beautiful, almost fall day here in New Jersey, and I do have my windows open, so you may hear like a little bit of light traffic, the birds chirping. I don't want to use the air conditioner anymore. So, I've discussed strange and seemingly impossible murders and deaths on this channel many times, but I've never found enough of them to do a compilation until now. I ran through these cases and couldn't believe it. And in researching and writing my new series of books about mysterious disappearances, the Gone series, I thought it would be cool to write about some very mysterious and seemingly impossible murders and deaths while I'm at it. Unfortunately, it does seem that some people are meant to be remembered for the mysterious circumstances surrounding their deaths rather than for the lives they've lived while they were here. Let's look at some strange and bizarre mysterious murders that happened in locked rooms with no killer in sight, surrounded by a bunch of even stranger clues. Let's jump right in. One of the more well-known cases of a so-called impossible murder happening took place in the early 20th century and was by all accounts a real and true life locked room murder, as they're called. Polish immigrant Isidor Fink set himself up with a modest laundromat to run not too long after coming here from Poland. He set up shop in New York City. He lived in a small apartment that was attached to the laundromat, and by all accounts, he was very reclusive, and he was quite eccentric. Not only did he go out of his way not to interact with anyone else in his community, but he was seemingly obsessed with keeping himself safe from the crimes that he was paranoid were happening all around him. He kept his business and the adjoining apartment safe with double locks on the doors and thick iron bars over all of the windows. The windows were also firmly nailed shut from the inside, and this made Isidor feel certain that no intruders or anyone else was going to get in or out without his permission. However, considering what eventually happened to him, it seems that all of these seemingly drastic measures did him not one single bit of good. So March 9th, 1929 started off as any regular and normal day would have for Isidor as he set out in the morning to deliver some laundry to some of his many paying customers. One of his neighbors, a woman named Mrs. Lachlan Smith, said that not too long after he had gotten back home from making his deliveries, she heard loud screams and some bangs and thumps coming from his apartment. She called the police, but when they got there, which they did very quickly after she had called them, they found that the house was locked up like somewhat of a fortress from the inside. All of the windows remained barred and nailed shut from the inside, and the door was also locked from the inside. There were no signs that anyone had broken into the home, and even though police initially thought that they had found a spot where someone could have gotten in, they were quickly proven wrong, at least for the most part. They had found a tiny transom window that was not big enough for an adult human being to go through, even if the person was small, slight, and short. It just didn't seem possible. By the way, I had to look up what a transom window was for myself, and it's one of those little rectangular windows that are up above a door or above another window. No one was getting inside of that house unless Isidor had let them in, which in and of itself was highly unlikely due to the fact that he had no friends, and he was, by all accounts and by the simplest definition of it, an absolute recluse. The officers quickly found a slight and slim young boy that they made go through the transom window to go in and see what was going on in the home and to let them in, as by now they were pretty sure something was going on. After hearing what the neighbor lady had said, and with Isidor not answering the door to them pounding and banging on it and calling for him, it was safe for them to assume that some sort of crime had taken place. They were considering the house a crime scene, and the officers didn't want to have to break in and risk disturbing any evidence at the scene. Once the little boy got in and let the investigators into the apartment, they saw that it was in pristine condition. Nothing seemed to be stolen and nothing was rifled through. There were also no signs of a struggle. So there was nobody had rummaged through things. They weren't looking for something. The one thing that seemed to be odd, or at the very least out of place, was Isidor Fink's lifeless body lying in the middle of the floor of the living room with 3 large gaping gunshot wounds in it. Though the initial suspicion was that he had taken his own life, it quickly became apparent that that was not the case. For one thing, there were no guns found anywhere, and especially there were none near his dead body. Another thing that was very evident and made it impossible for him to have done that to himself was the fact that one of the wounds was on his wrist, and it was as though he were defending himself from an attack of some kind, or at the very least, like he knew he would be shot and was holding his arms up to try to protect himself, to protect his face or his body from what he knew and could see was coming. The gunshots were also very close ranged. So the shot that was thought to be by investigators the one that killed him was the one in his chest, and they figured that it had killed him instantly. Adding to the mystery was the fact that there were no fingerprints found in the apartment, including those of Isidore Fink, and the neighbor who had called them and who had been so helpful was absolutely insistent that she had not heard any gunshots at all throughout that day. She said that all she heard were some bangs and thumps and some screaming. She believed that a scuffle had been going on, not a murder. The lack of a weapon at the scene and the nature of the wounds led investigators to believe that it had, in fact, been a murder. However, that didn't mean the case was solved, and in fact, it only added to the mystery of it all. There were a lot of strange clues left behind as well, and some things that weren't there made it all the more bizarre too. There didn't seem to be any motive at all either. Despite being a bit of an oddball and an eccentric who kept mostly to himself, Isidore didn't have any known enemies. While he didn't really have any friends either, he did have to interact with people sometimes when he was out making his laundry deliveries, when people would come into his business, and also just with his average everyday and run-of-the-mill interactions with his neighbors, like the lady who had called the police. He wasn't rude or anything, and he would smile and say hello to his neighbors and return a smile and greeting to anyone who gave him one in passing. Also, if you remember, there wasn't anything stolen, and the place hadn't been ransacked or rummaged through at all, and therefore it couldn't have been a murder committed because the killer, wanted something that Isidore had. In fact, there had been lots of cash found not only in his pockets, but in some of the drawers around his home as well, and none of it had seemingly been touched. For the most part, though, at least in my opinion, the oddest thing about this case is how in the world anyone got into or out of this apartment in the first place. That skinny little kid could barely get through the transom window, and there was no possible way that an adult could have done it. It's just a fact. They couldn't have done it. I know y'all are probably thinking, well, it's solved, Gemma. Some tiny adult somehow got in. No. Everything was still locked and bolted shut from the inside when the police got there, so breaking and entering by any normal or usual means, or by any means at all from the looks of it, is just simply out of the question. Investigators were absolutely baffled, and they had tried their best to come up with reasonable theories as to how this crime could have happened. One theory was that the shooter had shot through the transom window, but that was very quickly ruled out. If you remember, Isidore's wounds were close range. It was a close range shot. They all were. And also, the angle was off for that to have been what happened. The wrist wound in particular even had gunpowder residue on it, which told investigators it had been fired at point-blank range, which is too close of a range to have been done from the distance from the transom window to where the body was found. Also, the transom window had been shut too, meaning there would have had to have been a bullet hole in the window or it would have been shattered, etc., if a bullet or three of them had indeed passed through it that day. Another theory was that Isidore had started arguing with his murderer outside, who then shot him in the wrist at close range, forcing Isidore to then retreat inside of his apartment to try and escape whoever the assailant was. But this was also deemed impossible for several reasons. The first reason this couldn't have happened that way was because there were so many people out and about in the streets that day. As if you remember, he was making his morning deliveries for his laundry service, and everything went down almost as soon as he had gotten home. Not to mention the fact that there wasn't blood everywhere, as though it had been trails, and there's no way the assailant or Isidore could have then locked the door, locked the locks back on the door. So, he gets shot in the wrist outside, he somehow makes his way back into the house and locks the door. Well, where do the other two shots come from? And there would be blood. There would have been a trail of blood. Isidore was dead, so he couldn't have locked the locks back up. He couldn't have locked the home back up. And any would-be assailant wouldn't have been able to lock up on the inside and still get out of the door. The same goes for the windows or any other entrances/exits the police were considering for an escape route. Another theory put forth was that the killer was incredibly small and very agile, and that they had simply been able to climb through the transom window. Then, in this scenario, the would-be killer would have been able to kill Mr. Fink and then escape back out the way he had gotten in. Now, while I'm thinking about it now, and I didn't put this in the script, how did they then close and lock the transom window? Right? However, this would have meant that Isidore was killed by someone the size of a small child. They decided, after all, that it was unreasonable and even a bit irrational to believe a child-sized, gun-toting killer had done the deed, left no evidence at all behind, including fingerprints, and expertly escaped with no one the wiser to their dastardly crime. I've worded this in such a ridiculous way because, in my opinion, it's a ridiculous theory in the first place. Let's also not forget the fact that not one single person had heard any gunshots, let alone 3, and only one neighbor had come forward and said she heard anything at all, and all she heard was a scuffle. There were some paranormal theories put out there as well, such as he was killed by a ghost, which, by the way, isn't impossible, but ghosts don't use guns. Ghosts and spirits don't use our human weapons and wouldn't have murdered him by shooting him 3 times with a gun. Another theory, and in the beginning I was considering at least part of this one, was that he had manifested his fear of being hurt, murdered, and or the victim of a heinous crime because he was so incredibly paranoid about being murdered, hurt, and or the victim of a heinous crime. Even if that was the case, and to me it's the most reasonable thing, the most reasonable theory that's been presented thus far, there was no real motive otherwise, and it happened somewhat because Isidore had manifested it, right? So let's say that was the case. There still would have had to have been a killer to commit the crime, and that leads us back to all of the issues with the case that we already went over. This murder has never been solved. No clues or leads have ever come to shed any light on the subject. No suspect has ever been apprehended, and this case has been analyzed, discussed, and debated for years since, with nothing ever making any sense. The trail has gone cold, and has done so long ago, and this case is seemingly just one in a long list of so-called impossible murders. It remains one of the most enigmatic murder cases in American history to this very day. From the same era comes the case of a man named Joseph Brown Elwell, and it's just as baffling and mysterious as the case of Isidore Fink. Joseph Brown Elwell was a wealthy socialite, professional card player, and quote-unquote playboy, with his playground being New York City in the early 1920s. On June 11th, 1920, Joseph's housekeeper let herself into his house, as she did every day she was supposed to be working there, and she found Joseph in the living room with a gunshot wound to his forehead. The door had been locked from the inside, and no one but the housekeeper and Mr. Elwell had any keys. Joseph looked like he had been relaxing, like it had just been another day for him. In fact, he had been doing the somewhat usual and mundane task of opening his mail. There was a pile of mail beside him on a small table and an open letter in his lap. Also, on the side table right next to him was the bullet that killed him, standing very nice and neatly as though it had been placed there on purpose. When authorities arrived, they very quickly learned that the room had not only been locked, but bolted shut from the inside, and that the rest of the house had been locked and bolted up the very same way as well. A search of the home turned up no weapons or guns at all, and they had specifically been looking for the type of gun that killed him, which turned out to be a .45 automatic. I don't know if that's supposed to be .45 automatic. I don't know anything about guns. The house was large and opulent and stunk of great wealth, but nothing had been stolen, and just like in the case of Isidore Fink, nothing seemed to have been rummaged or gone through either. Nothing had been stolen according to the housekeeper, and nothing was out of place according to her either. There were no signs of any struggles, no signs of a break-in anywhere on the property, and there were also no foreign fingerprints found anywhere inside of the home. None of the neighbors reported hearing anything suspicious either, and they hadn't seen any suspicious-looking individuals. So the way he was found was pretty weird too, as it looked as though he was just relaxing and going through his mail. There were no signs that he had tried to fight off anyone or defend himself, and he had seemingly been killed by a single perfectly placed bullet hole that had been fired anywhere from 3 to 5 feet away from where he sat. The angle placed the weapon lower than his head, and it was as though someone had been sitting on the floor in front of him at a distance of about 3 to 5 feet and took him completely unaware in shooting him. After they had done the deed, they then went and got the bullet that killed him and neatly placed it there on the side table as some sort of macabre trophy for investigators to see. It was almost as if whoever had murdered Joseph Elwell was taunting them with it. The motive wasn't an easy one to figure out in this case either, but that was because he had a lot of enemies that he had made over the years. He had made enemies all over the city, in fact, by openly cheating and beating people out of their hard-earned money in high-stakes card games. He was also unrepentant in his flagrant way of running all around town and having affairs with married women. Knowingly so. There were said to have been so many potential suspects that the police didn't even know where to start. They didn't know where to begin. The people who were closest to him and even random acquaintances were interviewed, and at the end of the day, no one was really surprised that he was murdered. It was just a matter of who had killed him that was the issue. The best idea that police and investigators could come up with was that whoever did it had to have known Joseph fairly well, because he seemed to have been so relaxed and at such ease the moment that he was killed. It didn't seem to anyone like he had expected it or seen it coming in any way. I mean, he was just casually sitting, looking through all of his mail while the person was there, presumably visiting with him. Still to this day, no one has any clue who could have murdered Joseph Elwell, and the whole thing remains a mystery. The biggest mystery of all, at least according to most people, is how whoever killed him got out of the house after killing him. The person had to get into the apartment, murder him without raising any alarms, and while he sat there lounging in his chair. But then, whoever it was had to also leave the home without raising any alarms or suspicion, and while also being able to lock everything back up from the inside, all while not being detected and making no noticeable noises to alert any neighbors or anyone else who could have been a potential witness, and while leaving behind no fingerprints. Also, we have to wonder why the killer picked up the bullet and placed it like that, gently down on the coffee table next to the body. Why hadn't he or she just left it where it fell after ripping through his body? That's really bizarre. I don't know. That really stuck out to me as like, it's like another level. Like now it's creepy and eerie too. The police certainly did not have a clue or any clues, and still today, no one does. No one's ever been arrested for this crime, and no one had or has ever been named a suspect either. This mystery inspired a detective novel called The Benson Murder Case. This novel is what's referred to as, quote, a locked room mystery, end quote, and apparently this story jump-started a whole new genre of similar novels, novellas, and stories, but still in all, this case is one big, mysterious, unsolved crime. So now we're going to discuss a case I covered in its own video here on my channel, and this one also remains a mystery to this day. I was so intrigued and drawn in by this case that it was one of the first true crime videos I covered, and then I later rebooted it or recovered it here on this channel. It's baffling and it's wild. So let's once again discuss the murder of Julia Wallace. I am only covering the highlights of these cases here, but you can find the full video to this one linked in the description box if you're interested in all of the strange and gritty and bizarre details of this one, and believe me, there are many. So, in the early 1930s, Julia Wallace and her husband, an insurance salesman named William Herbert Wallace, lived in Liverpool, England. On the night of January 18th, 1931, Mr. Wallace arrived at the Liverpool Chess Club, and while there, he received a strange message from a mysterious stranger who had called himself R.M. Qualtrough. R.M. Qualtrough had given an employee at the chess club who answered the phone an address with instructions to pass along to Mr. Wallace once he arrived. The message was for Wallace to go to the address provided to discuss an important insurance issue. Thinking that this could possibly be a sale in the time of a depression, Wallace put aside his strange feelings that he had about the mysterious stranger and how odd the request was to meet at a random address on a seemingly random day, and he went off on his way. Though he felt strange about it from the very beginning, and also although he hadn't ever heard of the man who sent the message, Wallace went the following day to find the address and to presumably meet the man. He thought it was for work and wasn't as worried maybe as he should have been. He made his way to the given address, which was 25 Menlove Gardens East, but soon realized that no such address existed. While looking for the non-existent address, Wallace also asked around the neighborhood if anyone had ever heard of R.M. Qualtrough, and he couldn't find a single person who said they had ever heard of such a man. Frustrated and extremely confused, William decided to cut his losses, and he headed back home. Little did he know, a shocking and grisly crime scene awaited him there. Upon returning home, he found all of the doors were locked from the inside, and his wife wasn't answering the door as she should have been. When the doors were finally opened, and like I said, there's a lot I am leaving out here, so you can go to the original video if you want to learn more. William found the body of his wife lying on the floor, and her blood splattered all over the walls and everywhere else around her. Mrs. Wallace had been brutally beaten to death, and the police would later determine that she had been hit in the head with such brutal force that it was almost unlike anything they had ever seen before. They concluded that she had to have been bashed in the head at least 11 times with some sort of heavy and blunt object. However, there was no sign of the murder weapon anywhere in, near, or around the home. In fact, there was no sign that anyone other than Mrs. Wallace had been in the home at all, and no one in the area had seen or heard anything suspicious. In having no weapon, no witnesses, and no evidence, the police were merely left with a violent scene inside of a thoroughly locked home. Just like with the other murders we've talked about already, there wasn't a motive that anyone could easily guess at. Robbery didn't seem likely, as her handbag, cash, and plenty of other valuables were lying out and all around the home in plain sight. Theories abound as to who could have done such a horrible thing, and investigators wondered what, if anything, it had to do with the man who called himself R.M. Qualtrough. Upon further investigation, there were several people living in the area with the surname Qualtrough, but there was absolutely no evidence at all that any of them had even known the Wallaces or William himself, let alone that they had placed that call and orchestrated this mysterious plot in order to conduct this horrific murder. Every single one of them adamantly denied having anything to do with it, and since there was no evidence to the contrary, the police tended to believe them and didn't think any of the Qualtroughs that they had interviewed did have anything to do with it. In fact, a lot of the suspicion fell on William Wallace himself because people knew and reported to the police that there had been trouble in his marriage. Julia was known to be a woman who was hard to deal with, and from what I understand, we would more than likely refer to her as a Karen in today's society. There were also some seriously strange details that came out that seemingly, at least from the investigator's standpoints, implicated William in the crime. First of all, the phone call that was made to the chess club was found to have been made from a phone booth just a few hundred yards away from the Wallaces' home. Also, the timing of the phone call was strange, in that the call was made and the instructions and message was given to the employee at the club, and then, in the exact amount of time it would have taken someone to walk from the phone booth to the chess club, William showed up claiming to have walked from his home to the club. This is either strange evidence of possible guilt, or it could also have been a perfectly reasonable explanation. It took him the same amount of time to walk to the club from home as it would have taken him to walk from the payphone to the club. But the police had more than one reason to suspect William. The tram driver who had taken William around looking for the bogus address testified, and when he did, it did not look good for Wallace. The driver told investigators that William was behaving oddly while on the tram that day. He said that he was being very loud and behaving bizarrely, being seemingly overeager to let everyone within shouting distance know that he was a stranger to the area, almost like he was trying to draw attention to himself to help establish an alibi later on. Despite all of this being very flimsy evidence against him, the police did go ahead and arrest William Herbert Wallace, and they charged him with the gruesome murder of his wife, Julia. However, after a re-evaluation of the evidence, the charges were eventually dropped. Once Wallace was released, there were no other suspects, and the case eventually went ice cold, where it remains today. There are definitely more questions in this one than there are answers, and when William died only a few years later, he took anything he might have known or been guilty of to the grave with him. This case has since become one of the great unsolved murders in England's history, and in fact, when I first covered it, I gave it the name The Impossible Murder, and I would encourage you all to go and watch the full video. It's such a strange and very interesting case. Some people believe that William was the killer all along and that he had made the call from the payphone hoping to provide himself with an alibi. However, just as many people believe he wasn't the killer and that a stranger had placed the call as some sort of diversion to lure William away from his home so that he couldn't stop whoever it was from murdering Julia. Julia had a lot of enemies, right? There's never been any murder weapon found, no clear motive, no evidence one way or the other, and no suspects besides William himself. This is another locked room crime, and still to this day, no one can figure out how anyone had gotten into the home and back out again, while being able to lock it back up from the inside out. William had to knock on the door to get his wife to open the door, and his neighbors did eventually come forward and say that they heard him and saw him doing that. Or if you think he was guilty, then he was once again trying to make sure he had an alibi and that he couldn't get into the house without his wife answering for him. And if he didn't have his key on him, then how would he have been able to lock the house back up after he was done killing her? It can all be looked at from both sides and through both lenses and still make just as little sense in the end. Author Raymond Chandler once said that this case, quote, will always be unbeatable, end quote. I guess meaning unsolvable. Let's move on to the late 1960s and to a man named Sam Borg. Sam was 67 years old and he owned a little cafe in Malta, which is a country in southern Europe. He was not the type of person anyone would expect to be the victim of a violent crime or murder, as he was well liked in his community and seemingly by all of his customers as well. In May of 1960, Sam was seen outside of a club in the Maltese area of North Melbourne, and at the time it didn't seem to anyone like it was anything unusual. After all, he had been known to frequent various clubs and establishments, but it was strange after all because that would be the last time anyone saw Sam Borg alive. After he hadn't shown up to his cafe and otherwise hadn't been seen by any of his friends for several days, people started to become very worried about him. He was always out and about and talking to people, and when it had been nearly a week, a friend of his visited his house to see if he was okay, and when he found the door firmly locked and no one seemingly there to answer, he notified police. When they arrived at the scene, the authorities found the door to be locked and bolted from the inside. In fact, one of the policemen had to climb up a ladder and gain entry into the home from a small window above the door. So again, I think this was a transom window, it was called. That window had also been locked from the inside, and I would guess that they had to break it in order to gain entry. Once they were finally inside Sam's house, they were presented with a baffling mystery that still endures. Sam Borg's deceased body was found, oddly enough, under a bed in one of the upstairs rooms. It was wrapped in sheets and had rags draped over the head, and it had been there for at least a few days. The cause of death seemed obvious in that it was some sort of blunt force trauma to the head, later found to have been caused probably by a chair leg that had been broken off one of the chairs already in the home. The whole scene was extremely bizarre, but the strangest thing of all was that the house was locked up tight from the inside. The front door was bolted, so it wasn't like someone could have just had a key and then locked the door behind themselves when they were done. The windows and any other doors in the home were also locked from the inside, and investigators were baffled as to how anyone could have gotten out of the home, but yet still with it locked and bolted up tight the way it was. Throughout their investigation, the police found an unfired pistol in the bed where Sam's body was found under. Robbery was immediately ruled out because there had also been found 100 pounds in cash lying right out in plain sight. Later on, though, it would be suspected that some money had likely been stolen from somewhere, but there was nothing definitive, including the presumed murder weapon, and everything is up in the air and considered to be no more than theoretical at this point. No evidence of a break-in was ever found, and oddly enough, the windows were found to have been nailed shut from the inside, and both doors to the home were bolted from the inside as well. Obviously, Sam couldn't have killed himself, or at least it's incredibly unlikely that he did so, as most people don't bludgeon themselves to death and then wrap themselves in sheets and hide under a bed. In the end, it was considered a robbery and somewhat written off, with the police theorizing that someone must have nailed the windows shut and bolted the doors. Then they escaped through a teeny tiny little skylight that no grown adult could have possibly fit through. I would ask them why in the world someone would choose to exit through a skylight where they would more than likely get stuck unless they were able to squeeze and contort their body in such an impossible way just to get through, when they could have saved themselves a lot of trouble by going through one of the doors or windows. After all, they easily could have removed the nails or unlocked the bolts and simply left in a normal fashion. This is another case that remains unsolved to this day. I found some more recent cases, and this one happened in 1995 in Oslo, Norway. On May 31st, 1995, at around 10:44 p.m., a woman checked into the Oslo Plaza Hotel in Oslo. This hotel at the time was luxurious and opulent and was known to be frequented by the rich and famous. The woman was dressed up elaborately, definitely looking the part of being at the very least an extremely wealthy socialite. She was wearing expensive designer clothes, and she had checked in under the name Jennifer Fairgate. At the time, no one batted an eye, and she was seemingly just another wealthy and classy woman checking into the fancy and expensive hotel for a little solo getaway. She booked a room for 3 nights and paid cash up front, and while nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first, over the course of the next few days, things would take a turn for the bizarre. So no one had seen her enter or exit her room for the first entire day, which I guess was strange enough that the people that worked there did notice. Finally, a staff member saw her somewhat slinking into her room and hanging the Do Not Disturb sign on the door. For some reason, and this somewhat bothered me as well, but I guess it is what it is, the staff member thought that the woman's behavior was so odd in that she wasn't seen coming or going and eventually hung a Do Not Disturb sign that they tried to call 2 phone numbers that the woman had used checking in. Both were bogus numbers, and because of that, their staff member claims they also checked out the address and that it was fake as well. Alarm bells started going off again when the woman hadn't been seen again since the night before when she hung the sign on the door, and then everything went kind of crazy when she did not check out at the designated time. The staff was very worried by that point, and they went to her room and banged on the door, despite the sign stating that she did not want to be disturbed, but they received no answer. Well, they didn't receive an answer like they would be expecting. The only thing they heard in response to their knocking was the sound of a single gunshot exploding and echoing through the air and through the door. The police were immediately called in. When the authorities arrived, they had to force their way into the hotel room as it had been locked and bolted shut from the inside. There, inside of the room, they found the mysterious woman's dead body. She had died of an apparent gunshot wound to the head, and at first, it seemed like a cut and dry case of the woman having taken her own life, until the police looked a little bit further into the details. For one thing, the gun had the serial number removed, and it had been held at an upside-down angle, which obviously is not conducive for someone shooting themselves. The angle was all wrong, and it was found that the woman couldn't have possibly shot herself that way, period. There was also no gunshot residue or blood on her hands. Her high heels were missing, and all of the labels seemed to have been removed from her clothes as well. So not like the designer labels, but you know how, like, I don't know if you have little kids and like you write their name or initials in the tag or something like that. It seemed like the tags that would have contained the labels were removed. No purse, toiletries, wallet, keys, or passport were found in the room either. However, a nearly empty bottle of men's cologne was found, and it was accompanied by a small black briefcase containing 20 rounds of bullets. So, what the heck was happening? Your guess is as good as mine, and mine is as good as the investigators or anyone else's, as in, I have no idea. This case is a complete and total mystery, but it does get even stranger if you can believe it. Upon further investigation, it was found that the woman had checked someone else in with her, despite having shown up alone. The other person was listed by the woman as Lois Fergate. On the rare occasion that she had been seen alone, and no one had been seen coming or going from her room other than her, and only that one time. So, Jennifer Fairgate and Lois Fergate sound similar, and sometimes some of the documents that I came across in this research had both names spelled as Fergate. Some of them had both spelled as Fairgate, but the sources that I considered to be more reputable, that I use all the time for research, had the woman as Jennifer Fairgate and the guest as Lois Fergate. So nobody seeing anyone but her actually turned out not to be exactly true and was just the assumption the authorities had been working under up until that point, because another employee of the hotel came forward and explained that they had seen Jennifer with a man who looked to have been between the ages of 25 and 40, which I'm sure really narrowed things down for the police, and that the employee had seen the two of them entering Jennifer's room together. It's unclear how credible this testimony is, though, as there weren't cameras at the hotel in 1995, and no one else had seen the man, nor has he ever been identified to this day. The possible suspects in the case are listed as whoever Lois was, and a man staying across the hall from the woman who is only known as Mr. F. We don't know if Lois even existed at all, and there's been no information as to why anyone thought the man across the hall had anything to do with it either. The case remains cold and no conclusive evidence has ever been found or established. In fact, to this day, in 2024, no one even knows who Jennifer really was. Still, I think that that's the biggest tragedy in all of this. This next one happened in 2007 on June 2nd. That night, 32-year-old Hughes de la Plaza was out with some friends in San Francisco, California, where they were all bar and event hopping and having a great time. At 2 in the morning, Hughes left his friends at the underground SF bar in the Lower Haight of San Francisco and went home. A security camera captured him entering his home, entering into all 3 doors he had to go through in order to reach his apartment, and one of his neighbors had heard his apartment door close at around the time he would have been arriving. Hughes had been alone in the security footage. At around 2:30 that same morning, his neighbors would report hearing loud footsteps and the door to his apartment slamming shut as many as 3 times. At the time, everyone assumed it was just people being drunk and behaving as such, and no one thought anything more about it. However, they would rethink those original notions as this case spiraled further and further into the land of the weird. The next morning at around 8 o'clock, a neighbor passed by Hughes's apartment and saw what they thought to be a pool of blood seeping out from under his door and onto the front porch. They quickly called the police, and when they arrived on the scene, they felt they had no choice but to break down a rear door in order to gain entry into the apartment. Everything was found to be locked and bolted, say it with me, from the inside. When they finally got into the apartment, they found Hughes lying on the floor, dead from apparently 3 stab wounds to the chest, neck, and abdomen, and with several severe blunt force trauma injuries, which included some small abrasions to his arm, lips, and forehead. Not only the doors, but the windows too had been locked and bolted from the inside, and there seemed to be no signs of forced entry or any struggle. The police somehow came to the conclusion then that Hughes had taken his own life. Obviously, for many people, this theory just doesn't line up. For one thing, Hughes was known to have been very upbeat, very happy-go-lucky in his life. He was incredibly excited about a promotion he had recently gotten at work, and in fact, that's what he and his friends had been out celebrating on the night that he was killed. There was no evidence of drug or alcohol use or abuse, no note left behind, and there was nothing at all that anyone could point to that would make anyone who knew him think he would be thinking of taking his own life. Also, there were no knives found at the residence that matched the wounds on his body, and why would someone take their own life by repeatedly and ruthlessly stabbing themselves in the chest? Also, if he had done that, which highly unlikely, what happened to the knife then? Despite all of the obvious evidence to the contrary, the San Francisco police still consider this case a suicide because they clearly saw that no one else would have been able to leave with all of the doors and windows locked, bolted from the inside. Unless they could walk through walls, the killer would have had to have used one of the doors or windows to make their escape. Not to mention, though, if you remember what his neighbor said about the door slamming several times in a row and all of the loud footsteps, etc., there had to have been someone else there, at least one other person at some point, but the San Francisco police call it a case of someone taking their own life, and that seemingly is that. It's labeled as, quote, a suspicious death, end quote, but despite his family and friends adamantly denying the final conclusion, this case remains one big mystery still. What would the motive have been, though, and how would the killer have gotten out of the house? There are no answers to those questions, unfortunately, and all we're left with is another mystery and seemingly impossible murder. On Wednesday, September 15th, 2010, a man named Greg Flanagan checked into room 348 at the MCM Elegant Hotel in Beaumont, Texas. Greg had been traveling and out on the road for work, as he usually was, and nothing was out of the ordinary about his check-in at the time. Greg had always kept in near constant contact with his wife while traveling, but on that night he didn't call her as he always did, and those calls were as reliable as clockwork, according to her. This was so out of character that it caused her to worry immediately, and she called the police right away and told them about her concerns. The police agreed to do a welfare check, and when they arrived at the room, they found a locked door with no one answering it. They tried calling Greg's phone several times, but didn't receive any answer there either, and eventually the police did decide to break into the room to make sure he was okay and see what was going on. Even with the room being completely dark, it didn't take long for the authorities to find Greg's lifeless body, but there were no immediate indications as to what happened to him. There were no bullet or knife wounds and no outward signs of trauma anywhere on his body. Greg had been a very heavy smoker, so initially everyone thought that he had perhaps had a heart attack or a stroke and had merely fallen over and died. This made sense at first because of how the door to the room and all of the windows had been locked from the inside, and therefore no one else could have left after he died. There were no signs of a struggle or of a break-in, and his wallet was still in his back pocket of his jeans. It contained a stack of $100 bills, thereby ruling out that this had been some sort of robbery gone wrong or something similar. However, a more thorough investigation would bring this case in line with the bizarre, just like all the others we've already discussed here today, if not a bit more so. The autopsy ended up being a stark contrast to the outward appearance of Greg's body. His internal organs had suffered trauma, which were described in the report as, quote, similar to that of a car crash, end quote, and he had also suffered massive internal bleeding. Besides a tiny little tear in his scrotum, there were no outward injuries, so how in the world had he suffered such traumatic and ferocious internal ones? That was the question the investigators set out to solve. They interviewed all of the people who stayed in neighboring rooms to Greg that night, but no one had seen or heard anything strange, and no one had seen anyone but Greg coming or going from his room. This case stood out to me because it is technically solved, but the conclusion, it really doesn't make much sense. The men who were staying in the room next to Greg eventually did confess, and they said that they had fired a gun through the wall and it must have hit Greg in the scrotum, causing the small tear and all of the rest of the damage that he had suffered. However, no bullet was ever found, and the massive internal injuries were not at all consistent with a bullet. Some people believe that Greg might have actually been in a car accident, but then somehow managed to crawl back to his room and lock himself in. However, that doesn't make any sense either. Let's be real. If it had been a car crash, there would have been some evidence found somewhere of a car crash, and also it would have shown outwardly on his body, wouldn't it? There's no further information, and since this is an overview, I'm unsure whether or not the men in the next room over were ever charged with anything, but I really hope that they weren't, because in my opinion, it's highly unlikely and probable even that a shot fired through the walls is the answer here. This is one case where I do have to wonder whether or not something supernatural was happening, and if so, then what? I don't know, neither does anyone else, so let's move on to our last case for the day. On January 26, 2011, a 27-year-old Philadelphia teacher by the name of Ellen Greenberg should have been home when her significant other, a man named Samuel Goldberg, returned from the gym to find the doors to the house locked from the inside. Samuel thought it was odd that Ellen had locked everything up so tightly, and he immediately got nervous and broke down the door. He was shocked when he found Ellen's lifeless body slumped up against a cabinet in a pool of her own blood. He immediately called the police, and when they arrived, they concluded that Ellen had been stabbed 20 times, with 10 stab wounds being to her neck and head, and with 2 of those going deep into her brain. Aside from the fact that she had various large bruises all over her body, there were no signs of struggle or of a break-in either. The door had been dead-bolted and securely locked up tight from the inside. While it was initially classified as a homicide, the police, strangely enough, turned around and instead changed the cause of death to a suicide. That was despite the fact that people aren't really known for taking their own lives by stabbing themselves 20 times, with 2 of the wounds penetrating deeply into their brains and brain tissue. Also, she had been stabbed in places she wouldn't have been able to reach on her own, like certain areas of her back and the back of her own neck. There was no note left behind, and plenty of speculation and argument about the final conclusion being drawn that she had done it all to herself. Ellen's friends, family, and even her psychiatrist argued that she had not been suicidal. Not at all, and she had only been seeing the psych doctor for some anxiety issues. The lawyer for the family, a man named Joe Pedraza, remarked on how improbable the suicide conclusion was, and he said about it, quote, "In this way, you're able to see the 2 really lethal wounds in the back of Ellen's head. You can tell that it's very improbable that Ellen could inflict those wounds from behind. She would not be able to generate enough force to self-inflict. I think it's so powerful that it's clear to me that there's a murderer walking among us, or murderers, and that's frightening from my vantage point," end quote. Ellen's family continues to fight the official report that she had taken her own life, and to this day, no one knows exactly what happened to her in this case. The fact remains that no one would have been able to lock all of the windows and deadbolt the door from the inside without having to still have been there when Ellen's fiance showed back up from the gym. So this was going to be the last case, but as I was looking into this one, I came across one more that I feel we all need to talk about. And this is beyond the pale of anything we've discussed so far. Sometime in 2020, an 84-year-old woman named June Corfield and her 60-year-old son Stephen were found dead in their flat in Bracknell, England, when their landlord forcibly entered the apartment to do a wellness check. He became worried when he hadn't heard from the mother or the son in several days, and it was so highly unusual that he took it upon himself to go there and make sure that they were okay and that all was well. When his repeated attempts at calling them went unanswered, and when no one would answer to his banging on the door, he broke the door down and let himself in. Both June and Stephen were found dead, slouched over a table, but what was the most shockingly bizarre part of this case is perhaps the state the flat was found to have been in. Around the pair, 10 chocolate cakes were somewhat cryptically arranged, and there was also a note found at the top of the stairs, scrawled in a sloppy and seemingly rushed handwriting that said, quote, "Do not come in," end quote. There was more, though, and Detective Sergeant Liam Butler would later describe the scene by saying, quote, "Every electrical item had been switched off or disconnected, and the boiler and heating were unused. In the bin was a newspaper dated December 2nd, 2019, despite the fact that Mr. Corfield was blind. All of the electrical items were unplugged, and the main electrical fuse box was turned to the off position. The light fittings did not have bulbs in. There was not anything in the address that we would all recognize as items we would all use in our day-to-day living, such as a working TV, internet connection, phones. It seemed very sparse. As you entered the lounge where you had 2 sofas, officers found a female sat in one of the chairs, slouched backwards. To her right, they saw a male, again slouched back in the chair, with his head tilted forward, but to his left-hand side. Both plainly had been dead for some time. In between the 2 chairs were 2 Bush DAB radios, and on the floor next to June's chair was a handwritten note. At the foot of June's chair was an empty bottle believed to be a water bottle. At the foot of Stephen's chair was a half-empty bottle containing clear liquid. Both bottles were tested and were found to contain a neutral water-based liquid, the inquest heard. The note was filled with words, with some crossed out, but a section mentioned putting a message saying, quote, "Do not come in," end quote, at the top of the stairs, end quote. On top of all of that, the coroner couldn't determine an actual cause of death for neither June nor her beloved son, and there had been no signs of outward struggle or forced entry on either of them. The assistant coroner for Berkshire, Alan Blake, said, quote, "June Corfield and Stephen Corfield live a reclusive lifestyle. They had no contact with family members for some years and were hardly known to their neighbors. The level of decomposition prevents the common sense inference that both had been dead for an appreciable period of time prior to when they were found. It is possible that June may have died first and that Stephen was subsequently unable to care for himself, but I cannot make this as a finding of fact of the balance of probabilities. It is just one of a set of possibilities. The police made open-minded and appropriate inquiries. There was no evidence of third-party involvement and very scant evidence which could point to suicide. The rather cryptic and hard-to-decipher note ending in, quote, "Do not come in," end quote, which was left would not permit such an inference, and I do not make such a finding. There was insufficient evidence to determine on the balance of probabilities whether this was an entirely natural death or whether there was an element of the unnatural about this death. It cannot be established whether neglect or self-neglect caused or contributed to the death, and accordingly I am required to reach an open conclusion in relation to Stephen Corfield, end quote. I don't even know where to begin or what a lot of that means. So I'm glad this one came last. I would love to hear your guys' theories and opinions, so please leave them in the comments below. Was this a case of murder-suicide, natural causes for both mother and son? Did one go and then the other took their own lives? Was it murder? I do have some pretty strong, serious ideas about this one, but I want to hear what you guys all think and see where you take it before I remark on this one. That's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content, if you enjoyed hanging out with me. If you watched in the premiere and you enjoyed spending time with one another, spread the love by sharing this video. Subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure that that your notification bell is turned on. I'm a little tongue-tied. I haven't done this in a couple of weeks because if I keep getting less than 100 views on these videos that take me anywhere from 5 to 8 hours, I just don't know if I can continue to do it anymore, but I'm not going to stop doing it until I find something to replace it. In the description box, ways to donate. Donations are big. That will keep the channel going. PayPal, Cash App, Patreon, my Amazon wish list, becoming a member. I am kind of regrouping and rebranding the GemmaJade channel. It's going to be a lot of the same stuff, just done in a different, I guess, more efficient way. Also, I'll try to leave, there's still, the schedule is really tentative right now because Ghost Dragons has been sick and Ryan's been unavailable. I have not been able to work all summer, but I am back, baby. So we're going to be redoing the schedule with Live Intuitive Oracle, staying on Friday nights at regular time. And then these pre-recorded uploads will be on Mondays at 11 a.m. Eastern. Just like always, I will have some member stuff. I'm working on Gone Mysterious Disappearances Volume 4. Please purchase my books, Kindle, paperback, Audible. The links will be in the description box, and if you can't find a link to a book you want, because there are like 10 or 11 of them now, just go to Amazon, type in Gemma Jade Books. Please make sure if you get one of my books in any format, you go and leave a 5-star rating and a really great review. Wow, I am tongue-tied today. Anyways, guys, there's a lot. There's so much more, but I'm kind of in like a limbo right now with the channel of like what's working, what isn't, what I'm going to be doing, what I'm not going to be doing anymore. So rant over. Also, make sure you check out any live streams that I do. If you're on TikTok, find me over there. Don't forget, I do offer services offline. So readings through video, spiritual help through video. I also make manifestation intention sprays and spiritual helper boxes. Halloween helper boxes are going to be coming out in the middle of September and going all the way through November 1st. So make sure you order yourself one of those if you want information about how much something like that would cost. It's not too much. I mean, it pays me for my work and it pays me for the items. And I always put really cool stuff in there, homemade stuff. And a lot of it is custom made for whatever I see kind of on you energetically going on and things like that. Lots of big things coming up. If you're going to go to Power Unity in November, definitely let me and or Ghost Dragon ZW know, because we will be there. Maybe we could set up some sort of meet and greet and we can hang out, get some lunch, or just hang out at the venue together. That would be amazing. If you do nothing else, guys, support the shorts, please. I put a lot of work into them, and they are what has grown this channel so quickly in the last year or so since I've been doing them. So just leave, just like with all my videos, I would really appreciate it if y'all could leave, even if it's just like one emoji, because it does help me on the algorithm. And please like them. Hit the like button on my live streams. Those I do on this channel and those I do on other channels as guests, okay? The shorts, though, it's incredibly important that you do that. We need to get my content pushed out so I can grow this channel and maybe eventually start making some money off it. I don't know. Dreams do come true sometimes. Be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. If nobody told you today, you're amazing, you're beautiful, your birthright is abundance. Don't let anyone tell you any differently. I believe in you. I got your back. Always go in grace. Smile at a stranger. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.